Hello lovely beaders. Welcome back to my channel. Over the years I've used bead embroidery quite a few times because I really love the results. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I know the basics and I've made several pieces with this technique. As you can see in this little photo collage, I tend to keep my stone settings fairly simple. I'm not really into extreme designs. I have made some larger and more intricate pieces, but most of my bead embroidered jewelry stays on the subtle side. Today's piece follows that same style. It turned out to be more of a romantic design rather than something bold and extravagant, don't you think? This is still a bezel setting, but the final look is quite different from what I showed you last week. The resin cabochon used in this design is handmade. I created it the same way as the one I used in the last week's video. The only difference this time is the color and size. Instead of pink, I tinted the transparent resin with blue alcohol ink. I chose these materials and beads for this project. I don't really want to use anything else during the beading, but bead embroidery is not an exact science, so I might need something else for the final form. First, you need to glue down your cabochon onto the felt. And since this is a time-consuming thing to do because you have to wait for it to stick, I did this in advance. I used Hazelith glue and waited a few hours for it to stick. I don't really like working with beading thread, but it's the best choice for bead embroidery. I run the end of the thread through beeswax multiple times to make it easier to thread the needle and to prevent the ends from fraying during use. Then I tie a simple, preferably small knot at the end. The next step is to cut the felt into a smaller piece. I already have a plan in mind. I don't want this piece to be too large, so I leave only about ½ centimeter of felt around the cabochon. The first row of beads will be size 11 seed beads. I bring the needle up through the felt from underneath, close to the cabochon. It's important not to stitch too close to the stone right away, as that would make the beads tilt. Instead, place the bead next to the cabochon and aim for the thread to come up around the bead hole. Since I'm using size 11 seed beads for this row, I take their size into account and stitch a few millimeters away from the cabochon. I pick up 2 seed beads, lay them next to the cabochon. I don't pull the thread tight so the beads are not too tight in their place. Then I stitch down on my felt in front of the beads. I bring the needle up through the felt between the 2 beads and I am going through the second bead. And start the process again. I pick up 2 seed beads and stitch them to the felt. This first row takes some practice. You can't make the beads too tight or too loose. You also can't just bring your needle up from the felt anywhere, because that would shift the beads and make them sit unevenly. Even though this row won't be very visible, it still affects the rows above it. If the beads are too loose now, the entire bezel might feel unstable later. If you feel like you stitched in the wrong spot or your beads are sitting too loosely or at an angle, it's better to undo that stitch now rather than regret it later. Since I'm planning to do a peyote bezel for this piece, it's important that this first row has an even number of beads. The tricky part is making sure that by the end, there's just enough space left for 2 more beads. That's why I don't wait until the very last stitch to check. Instead, I check when I still have about 6 beads left, to make sure they will fit properly and not end up too tight or too loose. If needed, I can slightly adjust the spacing in the last few stitches or even undo a couple of units and stitch them again with a little more space. Like you see, I don't always stitch in the right place either. I have to undo my last stitch because my last bead is pretty loose. It's not a big deal. I thought I'd show you that this could happen and it is okay and it is easy to fix it. I just pull the thread out of the needle and pull back my last stitch, then thread the thread back into the needle and try to get my stitch in the right place. But now I'm going to make this first row off camera and then come back to show you the last few stitches. I don't want to bore you by silently sewing 20 more units around the cabochon. That would be a bit dull, right? And here I am with the last few stitches. Now I'm going to see if I can fit an even number of beads in that remaining space. And I'm going to adjust the beads accordingly to fill the space. Like you see, I would need 8 beads to fill up the space. They would be a little tight, but at least now I know I need to pull the beads tight and not leave my last stitches loose. I will speed up the sewing of the remaining few units, to not bore you with the repeated parts of the beading. Don't forget that you can slow it down by clicking on the cogwheel icon and selecting the speed you want. With my last 2 beads, I don't go down into the felt, I just pass through the first couple of beads from the beginning of this row. And with this step my first row is finished. But instead of continuing the bezel, I want to glue down and stitch down the cup chain. I need just a little bit of glue for the bezel for the first rhinestone. I know there are several methods for making this part, but this is how I do it. I put just a little bit of glue on my first bezel and I place it near my first row of beads. I use a tweezer to have a better grip on the rhinestone. And I let the glue to dry. Now don't look here if you don't like watching accidents. It won't be bloody, but one of the constant accidents of beading. I pricked myself with the needle. It hurt. I've threaded a white thread into another needle because I didn't want the turquoise thread to show between the rhinestones. With this needle, I'm sewing the rhinestones onto the felt. The key is to pass the thread through the connecting links between the rhinestones. So I start by bringing the needle up through the felt right next to the beaded row, just after the first rhinestone. I pull the thread through, lay it over the metal connector between the first and second rhinestones, and then I stitch down into the felt on the other side of the connector. Next, I adjust the 2 rhinestones if they need adjustment so they sit snugly together with minimal gaps. Then I bring the needle back up through the felt, again next to the beaded row, but now after the second rhinestone. I go down into the felt on the other side of the connector. And again, I adjust the rhinestones so they sit together with minimal gaps. Then I go up through the felt next to the beaded row to stitch down the next connector. And I repeat this process until I secure all the connectors between the rhinestones. But I'm not going to show you all the stitches all the way around. I will be back to show you the last few stitches. I'm almost done stitching down the rhinestones. As you can see, only 2 rhinestones will fit in the circle. I will stitch down the last 2 connectors. Then I will cut off the rest of the cup chain. I could have cut the rest off sooner, but I wanted to make sure that only those 2 rhinestones fit in the gap and that they were tight enough. And since my rhinestone chain wasn't too long, those extra rhinestones didn't bother me with the stitching. Once I've cut the remaining stones off the rhinestone chain, I take out the glue again. I need to glue the last stone to the felt so it doesn't move. For cutting off the excess of the rhinestones, I take my wire cutter and just snip off the unnecessary stones. Then I put a small amount of glue under the last rhinestone. And after that I will need to wait again for the glue to dry. I think the rhinestone chain was stitched on quite evenly. I won't need the white thread anymore, so I'll finish it off. I just find a thread on the back of the work, pass my needle under it to obtain a loop. I tie a double knot on the thread using the loop, then I go with my needle through the felt a little so that I don't cut my thread right at the knot. The back of the work will not be visible in the end, as it will be covered with a layer of ultra suede. I will glue the felt with the knots and threads on it to the back. So if the knot doesn't turn out perfectly, it's okay because it will be covered and the glue will ensure that it doesn't unravel. And now that the rhinestone chain is in place, I'm going to continue with the bezel. I am making a peyote row using size 11 seed beads. I am exiting from a bead. I string one piece of size 11 seed bead. I skip a bead from the foundation row and I'm going through the second bead from the circle. Then I repeat around. This row is just like the first peyote row of any other bezel beading, except that the basic circle is sewn onto the felt around the cabochon. For me, I think it's easier to make the first peyote row this way because it doesn't spin in my hand. I have a good grip of my beadwork. I will speed up the video again to not bore you with the repeated parts of the beading. Don't forget that you can slow it down by clicking on the cogwheel icon and selecting the speed you want. Like I said it before, this bezel is the same like any other bezel made with peyote stitch. And when you are making a bezel with peyote, you use tubular peyote stitch. In tubular peyote you work in a continuous circle. But each row still has an ending point, so you need to keep track of where it stops. When you reach the last bead, you have to step up to start the next row. And to do the step up, I string the last bead. I am going through the last bead from the basic circle and the first bead strung in the new row. And I make another peyote row with size 11 seed beads. Some people start a bead embroidery project with a completely finished plan. I also plan it, but since I usually make smaller pieces, there's no point in drawing my plans. And unfortunately, I often change my mind along the way. I changed my plans a few times along the way in this project as well. I'll tell you about these few changes along the way. With the last bead, I am stepping up for the next row. I need the size 15 seed beads to continue the bezel. The next peyote row is with size 15 seed beads. But if your cabochon is not so high like mine, then you can switch to the smaller beads sooner. Now that we have a moment, I'd love to ask for your support. If you enjoyed this video and found it valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving it a thumbs up. Sharing my knowledge here is completely free, but to keep things going and continue providing helpful content, I rely on your support. Your engagement helps the channel grow and reach more people, so thank you for being a part of this journey. If you'd like to go even further, you can buy me a coffee, or check out my tutorials and jewelry pieces. Links are in the description. Thanks for all your help. My bezel is finished. I don't want to hide my cabochon any more than this. I tried to see what the bezel would be like with another row of size 15 seed beads. In the end, I didn't like how it looked, so I undid it and the bezel remained like this. As I mentioned earlier, bead embroidery teaches me as well. It shows me what works and what doesn't. This bezel also came together based on intuition. If something felt right, I kept it. If it didn't, I undid it. I decided to leave this part in the video because it's also part of the process, how this piece took shape along the way. Just like in the next step, the decoration came together naturally. I stepped out of a size 11 seed bead, picked up a crystal margarita bead and a size 15 seed bead, then skipped the seed bead and went back in the margarita and into the next size 11 seed bead from that row. After that, I went through another seed bead and repeated the process with a lilac margarita bead this time. Initially, I planned to use 3 margarita beads, though I wasn't sure at first whether to use the lilac ones or the crystal ones. But in the end, I only added 2, and even those weren't placed according to a strict plan. I just positioned them where they looked best. As you can see, I initially wanted to attach the purple margarita bead closer to the crystal. But I didn't like how it was on top of the crystal margarita, so I pulled it off and went through another bead from the bezel so that it sits even further. And now they are next to each other, but they don't cover each other. I decided that the bezel is finished, so I led the thread through the bezel and went down into the felt to bring the thread to the back. Since it looked like that the thread isn't long enough to make the edging row with it, I secured the thread and cut it. Before trimming the felt very close to the rhinestone chain, I apply glue around the thread. This way, if I accidentally cut a stray thread, the entire rhinestone chain won't come undone. I also need to wait a few minutes for the glue to dry before I start trimming. The glue has dried. I need to cut the felt as close as possible, but I still have to leave a tiny gap between the cup chain and the felt edge. This extra space is necessary for stitching the finishing bead row. If you don't leave enough felt for this row, you'll have to stitch under the cup chain, which might loosen it. And if the cup chain becomes loose, it will dangle and won't look nice, meaning you'll have to sew it down again, which is extra work. The 1 to 2 millimeters of felt you leave for the finishing bead row can be covered with additional beads or colored with a matching marker. I've used both methods, but I'll show you later. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think I cut the felt evenly around it. Now comes the gluing again. I need to glue the felt to the ultra suede. Unfortunately, I don't have any turquoise ultra suede anymore. But since this will be the back of the pendant anyway, this gray one will do. I don't like to waste my ultra suede material because it's not cheap. So I find the place where I can use it the most and I don't have to cut off and throw away a lot of the material. And then comes the gluing. Now I have to glue it all the way around, but preferably don't let the glue run out. Also, I don't glue the very edge because if the glue hardens, I can't stitch it through to make the finishing bead row. But it must be glued well so that the ultra suede material is not only held to the felt by the last row of beads made on the edge. Once I have placed the felt on the ultra suede, I press and massage it for a while so that the glue spreads and sticks well everywhere. There should not be a large glue part in one place. It should be spread out, flattened everywhere, so that the back of the pendant does not have a hump. And now I wait again. After a few hours, I think it's stuck. Then I can cut it around. It needs to be the same size as the felt. I'm so sorry I went out of the camera's view, but I was so focused on the cutting and I wanted to see it up close. But you won't miss anything. I'm just cutting the ultra suede around so that it's about the same size as the felt. And I focus very hard on not cutting into the felt or cutting the ultra suede too small. Okay, the trimming is done. Now I'm going to color the white felt because I don't know how the edge row will turn out, how much the felt will show through the beads. And I don't want the white to stand out from the many turquoise colors. I have a simple marker, not specifically for felt or fabric coloring, but it has a turquoise blue color and that is what I need right now. I go around and try to color in all the white parts that are visible from the felt. Luckily, this doesn't take long to dry because the felt absorbs the color right away. Anyway, this coloring is just a safeguard for me in case the edge of the pendant doesn't turn out the way I imagined. But luckily it worked out exactly as I planned. But I don't want to rush ahead that much. You'll see at the end of the video anyway. I thread the needle with turquoise thread again, tied a small knot at the end. I cut off the excess after the knot. I hide the knot between the ultra suede and the felt by stitching through the felt so that the needle comes out on the front of the pendant. The edging what I like to make is a kind of a brick stitch, but we will use the edge of the pendant for making the brick stitch. I pick up 2 pieces of size 11 seed beads and I go through the ultra suede and the felt. I try to keep an even distance between the 2 stitches. The distance needs to be equal to the distance between the holes of the 2 seed bead, and they need to sit close to each other. And like in brick stitch, I am going through the second bead. This way the second bead will stand up and it will be straight. I pick up another bead and I try to position it right next to the second one. In this part one need to pay attention to my stitchings because if I want the back of the pendant to be nice, I have to work with stitches of the same size. But it's also true that I can easily fix it by just undoing the stitch and restitching it. Yeah, it really bothers me when something isn't exactly how it should be. Maybe it shouldn't bother me so much, but that's just me. Some things don't bother me, but this does. And yes, I know it's handmade and not everything has to be perfect, but it would bother me more if I didn't undo it than the extra work it takes. Plus, I really love the end result. I'm going to have to redo some stitches in this row a few more times, but you won't see all the redoing because I need to shorten the video. It's already super long. I'll show you a few more stitches, then I'll finish the row off camera and come back with the final stitches. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I know. At least when it comes to beading. I'll try to keep my distance and continue with the brick stitch. In this row I just repeat what I did before. I pick up a bead, try to go through the materials at equal distances, then I go back into the last added bead and start again. Nothing special, I just have to pay close attention to bead evenly. Most of the bead embroidery is finished with this brick stitch row. It's a very even stitch, it can be made with the same bead you used to make the bezel so it matches in color. And you can continue, you don't have to stop at this one row. I also add another picot row with a little extra. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Sorry for that. And now I'm going to turn off the camera, and when I come back I'll be at the end of this row and I'll show you how to finish the row with the last beads. I'm almost done with the row. I have to make 2 more stitches with brick stitch. I tried to make the beading evenly, although I needed to undo the stitches a few times, but I like the end result. And this is my last stitch. But I will need to straighten up my first bead so that every bead in the circle stays straight. To straighten the first bead I have to go through the bead from top to bottom. Then go through the ultra suede and the felt. And go back the bead again, this time from bottom to top. I could have finished this pendant at this point, I just needed to put a hanger on it. But I wanted to continue the beading. I will string picots on top of the beads strung with brick stitch. I pick up 3 pieces of size 15 seed beads and I will go through the next bead in the circle. The needle points towards the front of the pendant. To move on to the next bead, I pick up another size 15 seed bead and go through from the bottom to top into the third bead in the circle. This bead won't stand straight for now, even though I try to turn it, but I soon realize that it always snaps back. The next row will straighten it out. I continue adding the picots and the extra beads between the beads all around. But I need to shorten the video, it's extra long already. I'll show you a few more picots, then I'll finish the circle off camera and come back with the final stitches. You need to be extra careful when beading around the cup chain, because the claws of the rhinestones from the cup chain can catch the thread and it will end up ugly. Mine ripped, so I know what I'm talking about. I'm going to go and make the picots off camera now. Although I'll be back in a moment to show you how I made a bead loop for the hanger. So instead of stringing 3 seed beads, I string 5 seed beads and stitch them down just like when making a picot. But I turn back in the first bead and go through again the beads from the loop again to secure them. And then I go back to making the picots off camera. I've finished making the picots. I'm just stringing the last bead between the picots. In order to start the next step, I need to reach one of the beads that I strung between the picots. To reach it, I need to go through one of the picots. But if I go through the picot, I want to make it more pointed by going through the first bead of the picot, skipping the middle one and going through the last one. Then I can go through the beads strung between the picots. I want to make a row, a circle of beads around the cup chain. So I string beads between the beads strung between the picots. Sometimes I need to string 3 beads, but sometimes I need to string 4 to fill the space. But I go around and I fill the gaps with size 15 seed beads. This row will completely cover my felt. If I had left it white, it wouldn't be visible now. But back then I didn't know that I could fill in the empty spaces with beads so well. Sometimes everything I plan comes together perfectly and I get what I want or what I planned. And sometimes the beads just get stubborn, and even after redoing it a bunch of times, nothing that looks like jewelry comes together. Now I can call myself lucky because I only had to redo the beading a few times, but the end result was what I wanted. The last thing I did was go back into the row of the picots and make all the picots pointy just like I showed you before. I went through the first bead, skipped the second one, and went through the third bead. I went all around. This last step not only made the edge of the pendant more pointed, but also stronger. I finished my pendant. I finished the thread and cut it. I just need to put the hanger onto the bead loop. This is an easy part. I just open the hanger and hook it into the bead loop, then close it back up. Then I thread the necklace through the hanger. And I have a new pendant. I feel like I am looking into a bubble that is showing me the blue ocean. And that's the end of today's video. If you watched it and liked it, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for spending time with me. See you next week.